Starvation deaths have been reported. No milk, no bread, no rice, even for children. And this too has led to protests in parts of China. Acute power shortage for students at Wuhan. Reports of corruption. Now, over the course of the next half hour, we get you a detailed India Today exclusive report. I'm Gaurav Sawant. As always, let's get started with the headlines on India First. Political blockbuster in Gujarat. Heavyweights campaign for phase 2. Less than 12 hours to go for voting for phase 1. Three-way battle on BJP's home turf. Enforcement Directorate's big charge against Delhi's Deputy Chief Minister in the liquor excise investigations. Manish Sisodia and aides accused of destroying mobile phones and devices worth 1.38 crore that were used in the scam. Sisodia's aide Amit Arora remanded to 7 days ED custody. Liger in the Enforcement Directorate's net. Case against PMLA against South superstar Vijay Deverakonda, who was questioned in the probe into the film's alleged illegal payments and fund sourcing. Indian and American troops are carrying out joint high-altitude military exercises not far from the India-China line of actual control near Oli in Himachal Pradesh. This is the 18th edition of the exercise Yuddhabhyas, and this exercise is barely 100 kilometers from the line of actual control. News just coming in. China has objected to this India-US joint military exercise. Now, the aim of this exercise is to enhance interoperability and share best practices, especially when it comes to whether it's peacekeeping or disaster relief. Now, they form a part of this military exercise, but that's not the only part of this high-altitude military exercise. This is a fortnight-long joint exercise between India and the United States of America. Also on display, and we'll show you those images of the use of birds, kites, to destroy enemy drones. China has objected to the India-US joint military exercise in high altitude. The Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson said, and I quote, "The joint military exercise between India and the US close to the LAC at the China-India border violates the spirit of the agreement between China and India in 1993 and 1996. He then went on to say that India-US exercise does not serve the mutual trust between India and China. Let's listen in to Zhao Lijian. I'll get you more on the story.
The joint military exercise between India and the US near the line of actual control at China-India border violates the spirit of the agreement that China and India signed in 1993 and 1996. It does not serve the mutual trust between the two countries. We have expressed concerns to the Indian side.
I want to quickly bring in India Today's Abhishek Bhalla, who joins us live from Oli. Abhishek, China now refers to 1993 and 1996 border agreements between India and China, an agreement that China repeatedly violated, whether it was at Galwan or at Pangong So. But why is China so upset about this India-US joint military exercise, Abhishek?
This is a fresh objection from the Chinese side as far as this exercise is concerned, and China has said that India is violating the agreements between the two countries that was signed between 1993 and 1996, which talk about border resolutions. And it's rather significant that this is the same language that in fact India has used accusing China of violating these agreements in the context of trying to change status quo in eastern Ladakh.
Yes.
But remember, that was a completely different scenario, a huge mobilization close to the line of actual control, and also China, constructing temporary as well as permanent structures near the LAC. In this case, the situation is very different. This is about 100 kilometers from the line of actual control in Oli, where the exercise is taking place. Oli is not a disputed area. In fact, there is only one disputed area in the Uttarakhand sector, which is Barahuti, and that too has remained calm.
Okay, keep tracking that story. I will come back to you for more. But I want to take our viewers to China. Protests in China have taken the world by storm. And there are, if not thousands, hundreds of street protests in 10 to 15 cities across China, including the rest of Xinjiang province, where protests officially are not allowed. 1 million men are in concentration camps, but that's Xinjiang. There are protests in Beijing, there are protests in Shanghai. India Today's open source intelligence analyst Sai Kiran Kannan brings us different reasons for protests in different cities across China.
Blank white sheets. Mathematical equations. A WeChat mark suggesting undelivered messages. Hoofed mammals. If you thought the widespread demonstrations rocking the world's most populous nation is solely aimed at its harsh zero-COVID policy, take a closer look at the array of symbols protesters are carrying on the streets of China. A scrap of paper, her mouth taped and hands shackled. A bold statement of outrage at the country's stringent censorship on free speech. And so are these domesticated animals. A sense of heterogeneity runs through Chinese protests. Now spread from the west to the east, north to the south.
Crazy. I think first it's because of the Xi Jinping, the president. We should end his dictatorship. This is why many people died of him. So, but now it's a good news. It's many people getting to realize the president is illegal.
Simmering frustrations over President Xi Jinping's iron-fisted rule have converged on what are broadly called anti-lockdown protests.
Xi Jinping, step down! Xi Jinping, step down!
The boldest challenge to any Chinese leadership since the student-led agitation in the Tiananmen Square back in 1989.
Surprising in the sense that compared to protests in China in the 1990s and 2000s, and we see a lot of protests, but many of these protests restrain themselves by targeting local officials and trying to express their loyalty to the center. But this time you see slogans chanting like Xi Jinping step down, and even some call for freedom of expression.
Since September this year, various events have triggered scattered demonstrations before they evolved into full-blown civil disobedience catalyzed by China's tough COVID measures. Sample them. The detention of an anti-lockdown activist early in September in Shanghai. Starved and censored, anger over food shortages in China's southwest. Student demonstrations over power outages at a university in Wuhan. And this one made global headlines just days before Xi Jinping perpetuated his stranglehold over power as lifetime leader of China's governing party. The Bridgeman protest, the banners on a key Beijing overpass in October called the Chinese president a dictator and demanded his removal. A blow to China's international reputation as the world's factory floor. Labor unrest erupts in an iPhone unit over working conditions there. Another surprise trigger, the FIFA World Cup. Ordinary Chinese people watched the rest of the world rumble back to normal life when they lived a cloistered one for a third year in a row since the outbreak of the pandemic that originated in China itself. And finally, the proverbial last straw. Full-scale defiance boils over after a fire at an apartment in China's far west last week. Broader political demands for a democratic change unpacked in a people's movement in an authoritarian China. With Sai Kiran Kannan, Bureau Report, India Today.
Starvation leading to deaths, children going without milk, children going without rice, families going without food. 10 people dying in Urumqi high-rise perhaps was the last straw that broke the camel's back. Let's try and understand the situation in China through open source intelligence, through information that's in public domain. Joining me on India First, Andrew K.P. Leung is a China strategist. He joins us from Hong Kong. Sana Hashmi is a visiting fellow at the Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation. She joins me from Taipei. My first question is to Sai Kiran Kannan, our OSCENT analyst. Sai Kiran, protests over starvation and deaths. People actually died because of lack of food in China in recent months?
Yes, Gaurav. So there have been very credible reports, people following, especially the minorities in China very closely. I myself am in touch with a lot of Uyghur Muslims who are, of course, not in China, but, they're elsewhere, but, they have their relatives and friends back in China in areas like Xinjiang and other regions. And, the minority regions especially has seen a lot of essential items missing from the governance perspective, because you already have Uyghurs in concentration camps, and add that to the COVID situation, and you have a lot of people in quarantine centers and detention centers, etc. And not only that, the supply chain also sometimes gets cut off sometimes. Okay. So especially the milk was a big thing missing for little children. So they had very bare minimum necessities that were provided to them in these camps, and even residents in those areas they also don't have a lot of choice in terms of protesting. They're not.
Sana Hashmi, how are these protests being viewed in Taiwan? Is it just the zero COVID policy, or is this being used by Xi Jinping to clamp down? Because Taiwan seems to be removing the mask mandate just across the Taiwan Strait.
Yeah, in Taiwan there is solidarity. There are a lot of rallies that are being held in solidarity with people in China, and how people in China are being viewed as brave people who are standing up to the CCP. And protests are not novel in China, but how people are calling for Xi Jinping to step down, and these protests are against the CCP. So this is something that is being viewed very positively in Taiwan. So there is a ray of hope, specifically after what happened in the Taiwan Strait. But I feel for Xi Jinping, it's a very difficult situation in China, whatever is happening right now. So this is the protest that we are seeing. It's now aimed at the party. It's not at the local level. So I think this is something that we have to see how the situation is going to pan out.
No longer at local level, no longer against provincial leadership. This is against the Communist Party of China and Xi Jinping in particular. Andrew K.P. Leung, is that also your appreciation? There are reports of starvation deaths in Xinjiang. The building fire deaths may have been an accident, but starvation deaths point to serious problems in leadership.
Well, I think that most of these reports have been blown out of total proportion. The reason why I said this, first of all, the pandemics. According to the recent survey by the New York-based Elderman Trust Barometer based in New York, and they look at countries around the world and how people trusted their government in response to the pandemics around the world. It's a round-the-world survey. China came up tops. That was January 2022. However,
So January 2022, the situation is very different from November 2022. November 2022, there are thousands of people on the streets.
Let me finish, please. Let me finish. You want my interview? Want me to be interviewed? You've got to let me finish. I haven't started. So I think so let's bear in mind the survey back in January 2022. And I said, however, and you didn't allow me to finish. However, it's been 3 years into the lockdown, so there's been patience is beginning to wear thin. This is no way to suggest that the Chinese people are rising up against the Chinese government.
Sir, my question was very specific. I'm sorry, you may not have heard my question. You may choose not to understand my question. My question was very specific, sir, about starvation deaths. Starvation deaths, even a single starvation death is alarming, and here the numbers are large. My question is very specific. Xi Jinping step down is much more than general anger over 3 years, sir.
Well, as I said, I mean, these reports are blown out of proportion. Of course, there are protesters, and most of these are young students, of course, in prestigious universities. But I think that, as I said, the patience beginning to wear thin, but it doesn't translate into a revolt against the Chinese government. As I said, the Harvard Kennedy School study that was last year, again surveying all the countries around the world, and the Chinese Communist Party government was the best trusted by its people because the lives of all the Chinese people have changed miraculously for all these years.
Outstanding. You rely on those surveys. We rely on the pictures we see on ground, sir. Be that as it may, Sai Karan Kanan, issue isn't restricted just to starvation deaths and not just to one location. You are reporting an acute shortage of food, rice, milk and other essentials, and this is not happening just in the Xinjiang province. This is not just about how China treats the minority Muslims. Even the Han Chinese are suffering, it appears.
The Xinjiang province is a very huge province, and this report is only related to a particular incident. So let's not generalize it too much, because as I said, the whole thing is blown out of proportion.
Sir, if it was one city and one incident, that logic stands. If there are protests in 15 cities and for different reasons, perhaps you may want to look at it afresh. We are only trying to understand. Sai Kiran, please respond, sir.
Yes, Gaurav. So yes, you are right. So we are not just talking about Xinjiang province alone. We are not just talking about Urumqi or the Gulja place, the Gulja city where we actually had starvation deaths. But we are also seeing heavy lockdowns, heavy restrictions being imposed upon people. In spite of China, most of the provinces having 70 to 80% of their cases as asymptomatic. So it's not even that people are really suffering with heart symptoms. What people are not able to understand or believe is that why is the CCP and the Chinese government officials imposing such strict lockdowns that even people are restricted from going to groceries and buying stuff. And even people who are under quarantine, we also got reports that every day the basic food that they get is a bunch of cabbages and some potatoes. So that has also been a cause of concern even at the Foxconn plant, where one of the main reasons was the dormitories where people were quarantined. It was not very sanitized. It was not sanitized. It was not maintained well enough, and the food wasn't great as well. So this was one of the concerns as well. Secondly, China is also opening up their eyes because this World Cup was a big shocker for them. The FIFA World Cup in Qatar, that was a big shocker. And after 20th November, when the opening ceremony was there, and people are just waking up to the news that okay, the world has actually opened up, and China has still not opened up in spite of the cases under control, compared to their population. And
no, but that's what I'm trying to understand. Is COVID being used, Sana, as an excuse to keep people locked up? But the flip side is it's also impacting the Chinese economy adversely.
I think it's more about Xi's legacy. But what people are now realizing is that, as you also rightly mentioned, that it's not only aimed at minorities, and Han are also suffering. And what people are realizing now after Xi's third term, Xi is also becoming an emperor. China is becoming more authoritarian. So now these protests, the reasons are actually deeper than just zero COVID policy, that she is not going anywhere. And he's surrounded by loyalists. He's surrounded by people who are very true to Xi Jinping. So what's going to happen to China? So this is kind of resistance to Xi Jinping, to his legacy, and to the party to some extent, I believe. But I don't think the reason is that he wants to keep people locked down. It's just that this is a part of his legacy. And now getting away from that would be very difficult. Of course, we are seeing that there is some kind of concessions, there's some kind of easing of lockdowns, but getting away from it would be very difficult for Xi Jinping.
Andrew K.P. Leung, reports of protests in Wuhan seem to indicate, and this is, I'm now talking about mid-September. So it's after all the reports you quote, sir. The reason for student protests here was acute shortage of electricity, power crisis, and allegations of embezzlement of funds, power theft. Zero COVID had nothing to do with it, except perhaps be the trigger to bring people out on the streets once again.
Well, I think there's a great deal of misunderstanding of what zero COVID is all about, especially in Western countries. Because zero COVID doesn't mean not allowing any case to happen in all circumstances, in all places. It consists of four trends. The first one is earliest possible detection, earliest possible isolation, earliest possible cure, and earliest possible prevention. And overall, I mean, these measures have been relatively successful in terms of containing the number of deaths, as I said, compared with many
of
other
funds,
countries.
Power crisis, no food. These are issues you just choose not to respond to, sir. But be that as it may, Saikiran Kannan.
But of course. But can I finish, please?
Yes.
This is very annoying.
No, it is, but you're not answering my question either. It's equally annoying for my viewers if you're not going to respond to their questions. The questions about embezzlement of funds.
You're not listening. I'm putting it in perspective. And I'm trying to explain the strategy. And of course, recently, the Chinese Communist Party has already issued instructions to the provincial provinces to be more flexible. But with the recent surge of a new variant, of course, the application of these rules, of these more flexible rules, have not been even. And even according to the recent assessment of Goldman Sachs, because with the changing of the nature of the pandemic, even in China, China is likely to phase out most, if not all, of these restrictions by the middle of next year.
By the middle of next year, so embezzlement of funds is something that you choose not to respond to. Power crisis, food shortages, these are issues you choose not to respond to at all. But Saikiran Kannan, in Wuhan, students came out on the streets. They didn't have electricity, it was being sold elsewhere, and massive funds were being pocketed by officials of the Communist Party, it appears.
Yeah, it's a very interesting story there. So they were already under lockdowns, and so there was also a lot of quarantines happening for students. And on top of that, the rising electricity prices in China also contributed majorly for the college and the college staff and the electricity department being in cahoots and taking the excess generators away and supplying it elsewhere. Eventually, they were caught, after the students went onto the street and protested. But yes, this was also as a a result of massive corruption in the electricity department because of the rising electricity prices.
I've run out of time on this part of the show, but our effort was to bring out information through open source intelligence. China is not giving out any information on this, but through open source intelligence, we wanted to bring out that these protests are happening from Xinjiang in the west to Shanghai in the east. It's happening through Wuhan, through Beijing, through Chengdu, and almost every city, there's a different reason for the protests. And it's not just students. A large number of the Chinese people, their civil society, now out on the streets. But will they continue to be on the streets, or will there be a massive clampdown because Xi Jinping, or Emperor Xi Jinping as they say, is now all-powerful?